The moment pride met perfection. The dojo was silent except for the rhythmic sound of Bruce Lee's footsteps on the mat. His movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, a dance of precision and explosiveness. He trained Chisaw, his arms glued to his partner's, feeling every slight variation in pressure, anticipating each intention before it even materialized. It was there, in that space between thought and action, that Bruce Lee perfected his art. Richard Bustillo watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. As one of the first students of Jeet Kune, he knew the principles better than most. I knew that Bruce taught us not to stick to forms, to react to the moment, to be like water. But at that moment, a voice whispered in his mind, I can surprise you. It wasn't pure arrogance. Bustillo had technique, speed and years of experience. But there was something about Bruce that challenged even the most confident, a presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room, an intensity that made every movement seem inevitable. Still, he decided to test it. When Bruce finished the sequence and turned to grab a towel, Bustillo approached from behind, quick and silent, like a predator. His plan was simple, a light blow to the shoulder, just to show that even the master could be caught off guard. But at the exact moment his hand reached out, Bruce spun around. It wasn't a sudden movement, nor an exaggerated reaction. It was as if he already knew. His body shifted at a perfect angle, avoiding Bustillo's touch as his own hand moved, gently but firm, to intercept the student's wrist. A second later, Bustillo found himself with his arm immobilized, his face inches from the mat, unable to understand how he had been knocked off balance so quickly. Bruce released him as naturally as he had intercepted him. There was no triumph in his eyes, just a calm that made everything more disconcerting. You thought too much, Bruce said, extending his hand to help Bustillo to his feet. Jeet Kune is not about tricks. It's about feeling. When you hesitate, even for a second, you've already lost. Bustillo rubbed his wrist, still dazed. It didn't hurt, but the lesson did. Bruce hadn't defeated him with strength, but with such a deep understanding of movement that it seemed almost supernatural. In that moment, he understood something that would take years to assimilate. True mastery was not in trying to surpass the master, but in learning from him. And Bruce, ever the teacher, just smiled. Let's try again. The weight of the lesson. The following days were a succession of falls and starts again. Bustillo, once confident in his technique, now found himself dismantled, piece by piece, by a man who seemed to anticipate every move before he even conceived it. Bruce didn't treat him as an adversary, but as a mirror. Bustillo's every mistake was an opportunity for both of them to see deeper. You're still fighting yourself, Bruce said one afternoon, after Bustillo had attempted, for the 10th time, an elaborate counterattack that ended with him on the ground, without understanding how. Jeet Kune is not about winning. It's about not being defeated. And you will only be defeated if you let your mind trap you. Bustillo took a deep breath, his knuckles white from clenching his fists. It wasn't anger, it was frustration. A voice inside him whispered that if he continued like this, he would never be more than a student. But another, older one, reminded him that humility was not weakness. It was the only path to something greater. How do I stop thinking? He finally asked. Bruce smiled, as if he had been waiting for that question for weeks. You don't stop. You redirect. And then, without warning, it attacked. This time, Bustillo didn't block. Didn't calculate. He simply felt it. Bruce's fist came toward him, and he moved, not away, but with dodging at the last instant, as if the force of the blow had pulled him to the side. The balance remained. Breathing, steady. Bruce stopped, eyes shining. Now yes. The challenge. The weeks turned into months. Bustillo was no longer the same fighter, or the same man. Where there was once rigidity, there was now fluidity. Where before there was doubt, there was now certainty in the moment. But the real test was yet to come. It was a humid night in Hong Kong when the invitation arrived. A simple envelope, delivered by a silent courier, with an address and a time. Inside, just one line, prove that you learned. Bustillo knew what that meant. It was a challenge, not from Bruce, but for Bruce. Someone had observed their progress and wanted to test it. And for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. Just anticipation. Bruce, upon finding out, just nodded. Go. But remember, they don't want to see your technique. They want to see if you understood what I tried to teach you. The proof. The location was an abandoned warehouse, lit by hanging lamps that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. 3 men waited, each with a different posture, but all with the same intensity in their eyes. They were not amateurs. They were masters of their own arts, one in Wing Chun, another in Muay Thai, the third in Judo. The first to move was the Wing Chun practitioner, quick as a whip. Bustillo didn't think. Felt. The attack came, and he moved with it, redirecting the force to the side, using his opponent's own momentum to throw him off balance. A sharp blow to the solar plexus, and the man fell to his knees, panting. The second, the Muay Thai fighter, advanced with a sequence of low kicks. Bustillo absorbed the impact with a hip rotation, counterattacking with an elbow that hit his opponent's chin. The man staggered, but did not fall. The third, the judoka, tried to grab him. Bustillo already knew what was coming. Instead of resisting, he gave in, letting his body flow with the pull, using his opponent's own weight to throw him over his shoulder. The impact echoed throughout the warehouse. Silence. The 3 men stood up, shaking off the dust. There was no anger on their faces, just respect. Bruce Wayne trains his students well, said the judoka, extending his hand. Bustillo squeezed her, feeling something settle inside him. It wasn't victory. It was understanding. The return. When he returned to the dojo, Bruce was waiting, as if he knew exactly when he would arrive. There were no words. Just a nod. So, asked Bruce, finally. Bustillo smiled. I still have a lot to learn. Bruce laughed, a rare and genuine sound. We all do. And for the first time, Bustillo realized that the journey had no end. But for once, that didn't scare him. Because now he knew how to walk. The weight of the journey. The following months were of silence and movement. Bustillo returned to the dojo with renewed discipline, no longer driven by the urgency to prove something, but by the stillness of someone who had finally understood the path. Bruce, in turn, did not patronize him. He demanded more. He demanded everything. You've mastered the technique, but you still don't understand emptiness, Bruce said one night, while Bustillo was recovering from a brutal fall. The real fight is not against each other. It is against the fear of falling. Bustillo didn't respond. He just got up and returned to his position. The ordeal. The test came without warning. One night, while walking through the streets of Gotham, a scream cut through the air. A man was being dragged into an alley by 2 armed attackers. Bustillo didn't hesitate. Ran. The first fell with a precise kick to the rib. The second pulled out a knife. Bustillo dodged the first blow, but the second hit him on the arm, a superficial cut, but it burned like fire. He didn't back down. He used the pain, let it fuel him. When it ended, the 2 were on the ground, unarmed and unconscious. The rescued man stared at him with wide eyes. Are you one of them? Bustillo looked at his hands, stained with blood. One of them? No. He was not a vigilante. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had learned not to run away. Go home, he said, before disappearing into the night. The meeting. A few days later, Bruce called him into the Wayne Enterprises office. It wasn't a conversation about training. You caught someone's attention, Bruce said, sliding a dossier across the table. The League of Shadows is reorganizing. And they're interested in you. Bustillo flipped through the pages, photos of secret training, names crossed out, a recurring symbol, a sword crossing a shadow. They want recruits. People who have already proven themselves. And you think I would? Bruce looked at him seriously. I think you need to decide what you want to be. A student? A warrior? Or just another man who learned to fight and doesn't know why? Bustillo closed the dossier. I already know. The choice. The offer came in the form of an invitation. A black envelope, hand-delivered by a silent messenger. Inside, an address and a time. He went. The place was an ancient temple on the outskirts of Gotham, hidden among gnarled trees. Inside, men and women dressed in black trained in silence. In the center, a hooded figure was waiting for him. Bustillo, said the voice, softly. We watched you. You have potential. Potential for what? The hood was removed. A woman with cold eyes and scars on her face smiled. To be more than a man. To be a blade. Bustillo looked around. He saw discipline. Saw purpose. He saw something that, for an instant, attracted him. Then he thought of Bruce. At the dojo. In the weight of falls. In the void that had not yet been filled. I already have a path, he said, turning to leave. The woman didn't stop him. Just laughed. Paths can be broken. The confrontation. He didn't tell Bruce. It didn't need to. But Gotham had its own plans. A week later, while training alone at the dojo, the door opened. 3 figures entered, dressed in black. They were not students. You refused our offer, said the leader, a tall man with a scar on his chin. That was a mistake. Bustillo didn't move. I don't want to be a blade. The man smiled. Then you will be the meat. The fight was quick. Brutal. Bustillo used everything he had learned, not to win, but to survive. When the last one fell, he was injured but standing. Bruce entered just as the last attacker collapsed. You're bleeding. Bustillo looked at his hands. I know. Bruce didn't ask who they were. It didn't need to. They will come back. I know. A silence. Then Bruce nodded. Then you're ready. The end of the beginning. Bustillo never became a vigilante. He never wore a mask. But he learned that the real fight was not against external enemies, but against the doubt that still whispered in his mind. Years later, when Bruce was no longer in Gotham, Bustillo opened his own dojo. Not to teach techniques, but to show students that the fall was not the end. And sometimes, when night fell and the place was empty, he would still train alone. Because the journey had no end. And that finally didn't scare him anymore. The weight of the blade. The years had not softened the scar on his left forearm, the one he had gotten the night the men in white masks surrounded him in the alley behind the Iceberg Lounge. Bustillo still remembered the smell of cheap alcohol and aged leather, the sound of the blade scraping against bone before finding flesh. He hadn't screamed. At the time, I thought yelling was a defeat. The dojo was in a brick building in the East End, between a Chinese laundry and a pawn shop that only opened after sunset. The walls were covered in cracked mirrors and faded posters of fighters he had never met. In the center, a tatami worn by the time and sweat of hundreds of students who had passed through there, some to learn to defend themselves, others to prove something to themselves. Bustillo taught the basics: how to fall without breaking your teeth, how to breathe when fear tightened your throat, how to recognize the moment when the fight stopped being about strength and became about resistance. But on nights when the last student left and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired insects, he reached for the wakizashi he kept hidden under the mat. The blade was old, inherited from a man he had never called his father. Forged from Tamahagane steel, its edge was so sharp that it cut the air before it even touched the skin. He drew it slowly, feeling the familiar weight, the perfect balance between death and precision. He trained kata until his muscles burned, until sweat ran down his back and mixed with the blood on his hands, because, even after years, they still cracked when he held the sword too tightly. One night, while performing NP, the swallow flight movement, the dojo door creaked. "You still train as if you were expecting a war." Bustillo didn't turn around. "I would recognize that voice anywhere, rough, as if the words had to pass through broken glass before coming out. And you still appear unannounced, like a ghost." Bruce Wayne stepped forward, hands in the pockets of a dark overcoat. He was no longer the man Bustillo had met in Gotham. His hair had gray strands at the temples, and his eyes, always cold, now carried something that could be tiredness or resignation. Gotham isn't the same anymore. No place is. A silence. Bruce looked at the sword, then at Bustillo's hands, marked by scars old and new. "You still bleed. Everyone bleeds. The difference is what you do with it." Bruce nodded, as if expecting exactly that answer. Then he took something out of his pocket, a yellowed envelope, sealed with black wax. "This arrived for you. I don't know what it is, but the sender made it clear that it was important." Bustillo took the envelope. The paper was thick, almost scratchy, and smelled of smoke and metal. Inside, a single sheet with a handwritten message, in slanted and precise letters. "They never forget. And now, they have a name for you." There was no signature. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Bruce watched him, waiting for a reaction. "Are you going after them?" "No." "Why?" "Because they're not the ones I need to beat." Bruce didn't ask anything else. He knew that some fights were not fought with swords or fists. Sometimes the enemy was within the shadow itself. The name on the wall. The envelope wasn't the only warning. The next morning, Bustillo found the dojo spray-painted. Red letters, still damp, covered the outside wall. "You can't hide." The students arrived and were silent. Some looked away, as if the message were contagious. Others, the younger ones, the ones who still believed in heroes, asked if he needed help cleaning up. "No," said Bustillo. "Go home." He stood alone, staring at the words. It wasn't fear he felt. It was something older, deeper, the feeling that no matter how hard you run, some things always catch up to you. That night, he didn't train with the wakizashi. Instead, he took a brush and black paint and wrote over the graffiti, covering the red letters with kanji characters. "The warrior does not fear death, for he is already dead." It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The last lesson. They came 3 days later. They were not the same men in white masks. They wore dark suits and sunglasses, even at night. They were professionals. And, unlike the others, they didn't underestimate Bustillo. The first entered through the back alley, silent as a shadow. Bustillo heard it before he saw it, the sound of controlled breathing, the squeak of an expensive shoe against concrete. When the man attacked, Bustillo was already on the move, dodging the blow and breaking the attacker's nose with an elbow. The second came from the front, but tripped in his own blood when Bustillo cut his thigh with a knife he kept attached to his ankle. The third was different. Older, calmer. Didn't attack. He just stood there, watching as the other two writhed on the floor. "You're better than I expected," said the man. "But that doesn't change anything." "What do you want?" "Justice." Bustillo laughed. A short, humorless sound. Justice is a word people use when they want revenge. The man smiled, as if that was the answer he was waiting for. "Then let's call it revenge." He pulled out a pistol. Bustillo was already moving before the first shot was fired, rolling behind a parked car. The bullets ricocheted off the metal, and he took the moment to run toward the man, closing the distance before he could fire again. The fight was quick. Brutal. The man was good, better than the rest, but Bustillo had spent years learning to fight himself. And in the end, that made all the difference. As the man fell, the pistol slipped from his hand. Bustillo kicked her away. "Who sent you?" The man coughed up blood. You know who? Bustillo knew. He had always known. He stood up, leaving the man on the ground. There was no satisfaction in victory. Just the certainty that, sooner or later, another one would come. But this time, he wouldn't be waiting. The empty dojo. The next morning, Bustillo closed the dojo doors. There was no warning. There was no explanation. Just a sign on the door, handwritten. Closed indefinitely. The students murmured among themselves, some frustrated, others worried. But none of them looked for him. They knew it wouldn't help. He spent the night packing his belongings, books, weapons, the wakizashi. The next day, he took a flight to Tokyo. Not because he believed he could hide, but because he needed to understand. The man who had raised him, the master who had taught him to fight, was not his father. He was a killer. And, like all murderers, he had enemies. Bustillo spent months in a mountain monastery, training with monks who didn't ask questions. He learned to meditate, to empty his mind, to recognize the moment when anger turned into poison. And when he finally came back, he was no longer the same. The dojo was abandoned. The walls, covered in dust. But the words he had written were still there, beneath layers of peeling paint. He didn't reopen it. Instead, he rented a smaller space, in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. He no longer taught fighting techniques. It taught something more difficult, how to live with scars. And sometimes, when night fell and the place was empty, he would still train alone. Because the journey had no end. And that finally didn't scare him anymore.